Okay, so welcome. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I am Amanda Perry. I'm the executive director for the NACBS. And I am delighted you're all joining us to discuss Vera Keller's The Interlopers, Early Stuart Projects, and the Undisciplining of Knowledge. I am just going to briefly introduce our guests today, and then I'm going to turn it over to them for what seems like it's going to be a great discussion. So, Vera Keller is the author of 3 monographs and over 40 articles. Her first book, Knowledge and the Public Interest, 1575 to 1725, studied the entanglement of science with political theory as the experimental sciences came to be imagined as the form of knowledge most serving the public interest. Her second book, The Interlopers, Early Stuart Projects, and the Undisciplining of Knowledge, which we are going to be discussing today, was the winner of the Phyllis Goodhart Gordon Book Prize from the Renaissance Society of America, and we are looking forward to hearing a lot about that. Her third book, which should be arriving anytime soon, Curating the Enlightenment, Johann Daniel Major and the Experimental Century, studies how academics in the late 17th century labored to create the research disciplines and the research university as a means to incorporate undisciplined, advancing knowledge back into the liberal arts via infrastructures designed to promote critical reasoning and defenses against bias. Also, her next project, Super Ability, will offer a disability history of ability in the Renaissance. And so Vera is going to be joined today by 3 guests for discussion, Frederik Albritton Jonsson, Ted McCormick, and Debapriya Sarkar. And I will just briefly introduce them. Frederik Albritton Jonsson is an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago and chair of the Committee for Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science. He is also the co-editor of the Journal of Modern History. His research and writing covers Britain and the British Empire from the early modern period to the 21st century, with a special focus on topics in environmental history, political economy, and the history of science. His most recent book is Scarcity, A History from the Origins of Capitalism to the Climate Crisis, co-authored with Carl Venerland, and his forthcoming works include the first political history of Britain's fossil transition and an anthology entitled The Long Acceleration. Ted McCormick is professor of history and a fellow in the School of Irish Studies at Concordia University in Montreal. He is the author of William Petty and the Ambitions of Political Arithmetic and Human Empire, Mobility and Demographic Thought in the British Atlantic World, 1500 to 1800, which is also an NACBS Book Prize winner. Debapriya Sarkar is Associate Professor of English and Maritime Studies at the University of Connecticut. She researches and teaches at the intersections of early modern literature, literature and science studies, eco-criticism, pre-modern critical race studies, maritime studies, women's writing, and post-colonial theory. She is the author of Possible Knowledge, The Literary Forms of Early Modern Science. And so with that, I will turn it over to Frederik to get started.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's good to see so many familiar faces and names on the Zoom call. Those of you who don't know me, I've been dabbling in early modern things for a while now, and really have been following Vera's work all along, and I've found it incredibly stimulating. So I'm very grateful to be part of this conversation today. I've been told to offer up a few comments. I'm not sure exactly how long I'll speak, but let's say, Vera, what do you think? Just 3-4 minutes is okay?
Great, yeah.
Something like that, yeah. When are we supposed to finish this conversation, by the way?
Amanda?
It will be 1 hour. So at 1 o'clock, we'll finish the whole conversation, and we want to leave some time for audience discussion. So.
Okay, terrific. All right. I'll assume that people in the group have read the book, so I'm not going to try to summarize it. Maybe if you haven't had a chance yet, this will encourage you to get a copy and get going on it. And I'm sure the main topics of the book will come up in conversation as we move along. Since I've just finished a book of my own with Carl Venerland that runs in parallel to some degree with Vera's argument, I'll just concentrate on that bit and see what you make of my perspective, Vera, okay? So I'll start by saying that as an intellectual historian and historian of science, I've often been struck by how superficial our historical understanding of the idea of growth is. Like the fish in the sea, we seem so accustomed to the culture and politics of growth that we have a hard time treating it as a properly historical phenomenon. It's particularly a problem with 20th century historians, but even early modernists sometimes seem to assume it. So Carl and I tackle this problem by offering up a genealogy of neoclassical economics, and specifically what we take to be the axiomatic foundation of the neoclassical paradigm. The modern cult of growth assumes two things: insatiable desire and endless substitution. And that's assumed in neoclassical economics to be a state of nature, as a matter of ahistorical universal truth. But we try to show that, in fact, both of these aspects of the neoclassical paradigm emerge, in a manner of speaking, in the 17th century. In 17th century alchemy, natural philosophy, and political economy. So what economists take as an eternal axiom, we show is an historical artifact. And more specifically, we argue that we call this moment the emergence of cornucopian scarcity. We see it as the confluence of two broad currents. The first will be familiar to most, a new ambition to master nature. And the second probably will also ring a bell with most of you, a growing willingness to defend and valorize desire as a driver in the economy, in political economy. And obviously that's, at least in part, a response to the growth of global trade and early consumer societies. I think together, this idea of mastery and this defense of insatiability operated as, we call this a double helix. So spurring a new dynamic notion of nature and the economy. In the rest of the book, we identify 11 different conceptions of scarcity, different ways of thinking about this relation of desire and nature in European tradition. We group them under two headings, cornucopian and finitarian. Cornucopian ideologies favor active mastery of nature, and as I just said, a dynamic notion of desire, positive notion of desire. All versions of cornucopianism are rooted in optimism that nature's resources, however limited, can be extended infinitely by humans. And as I said, this tradition emerges in the 17th century and eventually reaches a dominant position by the end of the 19th century. And we identify cornucopianism as one of the culprit, if not the most important culprit, behind the planetary emergency we currently face in terms of climate change, biodiversity, and other crises. Now, Vera, turning to you, it's obvious that you've been thinking along parallel tracks about the same problem, and you have I think at the end of the acknowledgements, you have this very moving sentence about seeing the future through your daughter's eyes and reimagining the early modern moment, but also worrying about what is to come. So my question then is, obviously this book makes a specific intervention about disciplining and undisciplining knowledge. But I wonder if you can walk us through a little bit more widely how you see your own arguments sit in relation with histories of empire, colonialism, and also early consumer societies. Desire maybe isn't a key variable in the argument, but I'm still curious to know what you think of it. Yeah.
So we discussed that we'll just go in order and have the three different interventions, and then I'll just respond all together, and then we can have conversation and open the floor.
So I'll jump in then. I guess I should just say that I'll talk a little bit about, I think, what I appreciate about this book, which is really what I appreciate about projects and projecting as a frame. And I should say that Vera really introduced me to thinking in those terms, I don't know, 15 or more years ago now. And it's really no exaggeration to say that it's kind of completely shaped my engagement with my own work. in part because, I started my first book, as was briefly mentioned, and I won't talk about it much except to say that it was trying to make sense of this very complicated figure, William Petty, who's been, divided between half a dozen different historiographies. And I struggled mightily in the course of writing the dissertation to kind of try and see all of those things together and make sense of what I now think of or recognize as projects that migrated from one realm to the other, that involved different kinds of processes, different sorts of context, transformations that migrated from one place or one sphere of activity to another, to be able to sort of see those as integrated wholes. And really, projecting enabled me to do that, and has since sort of made a whole lot of things visible as integral historical phenomena that were otherwise very hard to see. So I really do appreciate it for that. And for me, the book embodies the value of approaching early modern history through the lens of projects. I've just talked about the sense in which it bridges or combines, or to use Vera's own term, undisciplines, the history of science, the history of empire, the history of political economy. I could go on. I think those are three of the big ones. And it enables us to approach interventions in those areas as generative, not in spite of, but precisely because of their entanglements with these different contexts. So I think that really comes through in a whole series of cases in the book. Equally as important and equally stressed in the book, it really lets us see these interventions as consequential, whether or not they succeeded or failed. And the agency of failure is a strong running theme in this book, in Vera's other work as well. And whether they succeeded or failed either in their own terms, on their own terms, or in the terms set by disciplinary historiographies of the various fields that they traverse. So I think that's a second sort of value there. Ultimately, and this takes me back to how it has influenced my own thinking on the empirical cases I work with, it really broadens the base from which we can approach, or through which we can approach, the history of knowledge. It really allows us to take in a much wider range of sources, of genres, as generative sites for knowledge. And it's, again, very upfront about that. But also it enriches our conceptual or analytical vocabulary, and in ways that avoid, I wouldn't say, invariably dismiss, but certainly avoid taking for granted what Vera refers to in the book as an idealized and normative view of what science is. And I think, three of there are more than three, but three of the terms that stick out to me in this sense are undisciplining itself, kind of destabilization of boundaries between epistemic areas, between areas of activity, between trades, between geographic contexts. That as not simply kind of absence of order or an antecedent to some sort of order, but as an active process in itself. This idea of extrapolation, which I would like to hear a little bit more about, I think. Extrapolation as the mechanism by which an intervention or a type of planned change migrates from one spatial or one epistemic context to another. So extrapolation is a kind of violation of these boundaries in a particular way. And interloping itself, as against the idea of science as something that settles a kind of terra nullius in the world of knowledge. I think one of the nice things about the book is the way that epistemic empire lets us talk about both the history of knowledge and the history of colonization in the same breath. And I think that the sort of one of the implications of interloping, to my mind, is that we can see what is ostensibly new knowledge as really, transgressing boundaries and taking up space that was never exactly empty to begin with. And I'll end there and pick up the discussion as it goes.
Hi, I just wanted to say I found this book so brilliant and inspiring, like all of Vera's work. I've been following your work since I was a grad student, and I've learned so much from it. And I think especially as I was trying to write on like kind of open-endedness, unfinished work, like especially in Bacon, I think your work has always given me a vocabulary for thinking about, like pushing back against, I think what here you're calling the disciplined and disciplinary nature of knowledges. And so I'm really excited to just sit with this book even more than I have. I loved your work on Bacon and the hint at the end. I think that's so provocative and I think opens up really interesting questions. I too, I think, wanted to focus on the term undisciplining because I think it just stayed with me in various ways throughout the book. For you, it operates, I think, as an opposition to discipline as a practice, but also disciplinarity in terms of expertise and bounded expertise. But of course, I think it also asks us to question things like buzzwords for us, like the interdisciplinary and the cross-disciplinary and the multidisciplinary. So I would be really interested to hear you speak about that. What I thought interesting about interloping as an undisciplined and undisciplinary practice was how it stands in opposition to, I think, a form of social leveling, which has often been a way to talk about the intersection of the social and the epistemological in history of science studies. And your discussions of Charles as someone who interlopes downwards, whereas a commoner who can interlope upwards, while still being in their own social hierarchical positions, is really, I think, a complex way of thinking. And I think that really opens up ways of thinking about actors producing knowledge and their relationship to their various knowledge practices in really interesting ways. I have encountered the questions of undisciplining mostly in the work of decolonial writers, Black feminists. I'm thinking of Christina Sharp most immediately, where that often functions as kind of like, an aspirational, reparative even mode of knowing. And so undisciplining is a form of social justice work, I think, for a lot of those writers. And what I just couldn't shake off as I was reading your book is that undisciplining and these early Stuart projects, as you say, hinged on violence and coercion and theft, like a complete disregard for human difference and of the more than human world. And I'm really curious how you would engage with this kind of tension between undiscipline as kind of undisciplining in our moment, maybe as a form of reparation, as a form of social justice oriented scholarship, and undisciplining in the early modern period as like really a source of harm as much as like more productive, even if it's producing all this knowledge, right? And I'm really kind of struggling with that because I think there is this thread in your book about how these early modern moments are kind of feeding into our own practices as scholars, as researchers, as experts. So of course, underlying this is like the question of like, how do we think about power in our moment and like the academy, maybe more than anything. So that was the big question I had, and I'm going to just tag on another thing that like stayed with me. You had this very small section on gender, where you marked that while women were not infrequently supplied, women not infrequently supplied skilled and unskilled labor for projects, they really figured in the role of the designer of the project. And I just kept thinking about that. And while I realized that like the women might not be the center in terms of like thinking about projects and interlopers, there are other arenas of knowledge production where I think you're crossing out the scale between the very local and the very global, let's say, I think is really provocative. And I kept thinking about like the work on spices and recipes, right? Spices being brought from various places to Europe and then being used in the kitchen, and these recipes, which are its own kind of future-oriented enterprise that you just practice. So I just wanted to throw in there to mostly ask you where you think this kind of like the scale that you operate with, like between the very local and the very global, how that might translate and allow us to think about even a wider range of actors and knowledge producers, often at the margins when we talk about the history of science and the history of knowledge. Yeah, so I'll stop there. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And thanks everyone to everyone in the audience as well. And I'm going to try to be pretty brief in response so that we can also get audience jumping in here and to hear what you have to say to each other as well. Let me just start off by saying that I kind of think of the three books that I just worked on as a trilogy. And Knowledge and the Public Interest was kind of the overarching, is 1575 to 1725, kind of the overarching framework, a little bit more theoretical, and then kind of grounded, two more grounded books that really engage more immediately with practices and, you know, situated examples of what I was talking about, to some extent, knowledge and public interest. So forgive me for referring way back to knowledge and public interest in some of my responses here. One of the things that I was contesting in knowledge and public interest was the truism that knowledge should serve the public interest. So just kind of looking at the public interest as a category, a critical view of that category, and kind of the harm and the violence that the idea of public interest itself can cause. Because when you claim that your knowledge is serving the public interest, that means that's a claim to power. That's a claim to say that someone else is serving the private interest and you should override them. And so that is part of that interloping into someone else's sphere that I then talk about in Interlopers. Let's say you're an artisan and you're pursuing your craft. Well, if I'm an experimental philosopher and I claim that my knowledge is in the public interest, you ought to give me your craft knowledge. You refuse. That's an example of you serving your private interest. So that's an example of a kind of an interloping mindset where you no longer accept that someone's space in life is their calling and part of a socially just view of society where we all have a space that we're supposed to be in, but rather that you are seeing this kind of wide open sphere of the public interest, which has no boundaries, that allows you to make claims to knowledge and claims over people's lives, bodies, spaces, everything. And part of that argument was to argue against the passions and the interests view of what interest is, which I feel was a very kind of justifying argument about history of economics and, you know, history of modern consumer society, to go back to Frederik's question, in that the way that people talk about interest in the 17th century, when the language of interest first emerged, is it's not a contrast to passion or desire. It is part of the passions and the unleashing of the passions. And the interest theory of the 17th century is to study human passion and to study how to gain profit and power out of manipulating it and unleashing it. So that speaks a little bit to what Frederik was asking about in terms of desire. And I was really contesting kind of a lot of the narratives about the importance of the rise of neo-Stoicism and the disciplining of the passions and the creation of a modern civilized disciplined self, which also appears very prominently in a lot of history of science narratives, as a way to explain the advent of modernity versus some sort of undisciplined wild other, whether that be pre-modern, the non-scientific, or cultures around the world. And so there is, to speak to Debapriya's question about the social justice angle here, is that there is an implicit colonialism to that view that the modern self is disciplined versus everybody else. It defines kind of civilization with what happened in the West versus seeing what happened in the West as a great undisciplining advent of desire and strategies, in fact, to foment more desire. So that was part of my argument in knowledge of public interest that I then hope to show in Interlopers how that took place. It did have a lot to do with history of alchemy, to go back to what Frederik was saying, and certain natural philosophical views about the ability to expand powers. And back in that book, I talked about how political views of rationality, like reason of state, intersected with new views about reason in science to kind of offer the political / scientific foundation to some of these very expansive, not cornucopian views. One of the distinctions, I think, though, with a lot of the ways that people talk about cornucopianism, for example, in the Hartlib Circle, to go back to Debapriya's remarks about social leveling, is that there was a lot of violence in these practices and social hierarchy. And so speaking on the gender question, which is one of, as Debapriya notes, weaker parts of the book, what I was trying to do there was to push back against one of the more recent trends in the history of science, which is to open up the history of science and the story of the scientific revolution to more voices. And so to bring in different forms of knowledge that would do that, like, for example, domestic experimentation. And in some ways, that can also serve as a kind of justification, again, for science rather than necessarily a critique, in that saying that modern science had more actors kind of spreads the credit to more people. Whereas sometimes what we have to look at is not necessarily the credit, but the responsibility, to go back to Frederik's point about my remarks at the end of my acknowledgements, saying that my daughter will have to have a more limited space in the world than what the interlopers were taking. I'm going to be writing a piece soon about masculinization of science, which will address, I hope, some more of that. Because I think that it is really important the ways that interlopers were taking knowledge, not just from around the world, but from domestic settings, and not attributing it. There were women projectors too, though, and so I will hopefully be doing some follow-up work on them, but that's an area that I need to work on some more. Extrapolation from that was one of Ted's questions. So one of the arguments that I was looking at in terms of the idea that modernity represents discipline versus what preceded it is that really the kind of intellectual framework of, for example, the universities that many interlopers were attacking was about disciplines. It had been about disciplines. We think today that we inhabit disciplines. What we inhabit now, research disciplines, are very strange beasts and not very disciplined, and I will talk about them in Curating the Enlightenment. If you want to see something disciplined, look at the universities that the interlopers were criticizing, where you could not extrapolate from one discipline to another. There were appropriate subject matters and appropriate arguments to each discipline, and extrapolation was exactly what you weren't supposed to do. In Aristotelian terms, it's called metabasis, meaning you're mixing together two disciplines. It's not allowed in university. And so extrapolation is exactly that kind of intellectual move that interlopers are showing off as look how non-academic we are. We're not pedantic. We don't respect these. We're going to extrapolate subject matter, ways of thinking from one place to another. There is a lot of mixture of disciplines, which then does happen in the research disciplines. And just to finish up here with a return back to Debapriya's question about how does this relate to kind of social justice moves of undisciplining, is I think we need to think more about what it means to inhabit disciplines right now. We think that disciplines are more rigid than they are, and we think that they are more real than they are. And to think critically about how knowledge has remained undisciplined even as it entered universities is a way to address kind of the coercive roles that disciplining might have upon us, in ways that perhaps could open up possibly anti-structural moves for the present. So that might not make so much sense, but Debapriya, I hope that addresses some of that question. I'd love to invite everybody else to raise their hand and come on in with questions or responses to anything that we've been saying, or any of the or Ted or Debapriya or Frederik to do so. It'd be great.
Yeah, everyone can go ahead and raise their Zoom hand, or you can also just drop it in the chat too if you'd prefer to, and I can read anything that comes up in the chat. So.
And Ted and Debapriya and Frederik, don't hesitate to push me if I didn't really answer your questions. Oh, he's gonna do it. Go for it, Frederik.
Well, I'll just ask you a question that came up at the end of your book, and also indirectly here, which is, I completely agree with you that risk-taking deserves a greater emphasis in the literature, and that we've been seduced by these arguments about disciplines to ignore it. But at the same time, if we step away from ways of knowing and the history of science, and we think about these themes in a broader sense as involved with the history of colonialism and capitalism, then it seems to me that we need to see risk-taking and these violent ruptures as part of a dialectic, where in fact moments of stabilization, whether we want to call them disciplined capital or not, are incredibly important. Like, take the example of plantation societies, which are only emerging in this book, right? But by after the sugar revolution, by the late 17th century, they assume a relatively stable form. So shouldn't we then argue that there's a place for projecting, and maybe it's cyclical, but projecting is always in conversation with these other forces, right? And that's true of not just of the 17th century, but the entire history of empire and the entire history of capitalism.
So this is a question I have gotten before about kind of, well, where did the structures that seem so disciplinary come from if there is this kind of undisciplinary core to projecting? I don't think those two things are in opposition. I think that it is quite possible to think about a snowballing undisciplining that continues over time, that we are still in today in terms of our interventions into nature that are constantly still using the language of advancing epistemic empire and constantly trying to push into the envelope further into the unknown, has not stopped. That is still the dynamic that is with us. There were structures of power that were in place in interloping even in the early Stuart period. So those two moves can work together, and sometimes that advancing logic can serve to support certain kind of structures of power. So, for example, advancing the sugar frontier, into kind of new domains would be one example of that. I would want to contrast that with a book that I want to give a shout out to because it's really great. Aisha Mukherjee's book, Penury into Plenty, which is kind of looking at how people thought about place and community and knowledge and resources in a non-interloping way in the late 16th century. So where you are really trying to limit your risk by having resources that are local and therefore trustworthy and kind of recycled, and limiting waste in that way in order to limit your risk, because what you're worried about in her book is dearth and starvation. Whereas what transpires with projecting is you assume that there will be dearth and starvation. As you point out in your book, that is, Frederik, that is the kind of motivating impulse for everything. This kind of idea of scarcity. So you're not really trying to necessarily get rid of scarcity. Scarcity is kind of the motor that things rest upon. But you are utilizing scarcity, and you're utilizing emotions like fear about it and desire for stability in order to devise various economic projects, which could then support kind of structures of power. So I don't think those two things are necessarily contradictory. I think they actually work kind of hand in hand over time. Dominic has a hand up. Hi, Dominic. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Vera. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. And I have to admit, I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I'm going to ask the obvious question, already hinting on the next book that I'm really looking forward to, the one on Maya, as you know. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about like the differences you see in different places. I mean, as a German, I of course asked the question, like, what is the kind of Stuart system and what is the kind of German, very different model? And if you see what, just out of curiosity, if you see any examples of things that are quite alike and others are very different.
Mm. Oh my goodness. So that's a
It's
question
not too big, sorry.
for a couple hours. But I will say a couple of things. One is that just to put this in, love to talk about Bacon a little bit. And heads up, everyone, it's Bacon's 400th in 2026. I don't know that anyone is really planning anything for that, so we should kind of think about that. So Bacon, for example, the New Atlantis, is imagining a scenario with a great deal of material institutions that he wished existed that don't exist in England, that do exist in Central Europe. So that's one of the really big differences, is that there were this humongous kind of princes investing in various infrastructures, laboratories, collections, etc., huge material investments in Central Europe in a way that hadn't happened in the same way in England. So there's a big difference there, and to some ways that is an advantage for interlopers because they have kind of this like latitude to kind of think of things in a different way, whereas there was a practice in place in Central Europe. When I get into my next book, one of the really interesting things is Johann Daniel Meyer writes a science fiction in 1670 based on New Atlantis, but rather than it being imagining a material infrastructure in place, it is all an intellectual infrastructure. It takes place in the skies, and there's this like aerial kingdom of knowledge. There's no infrastructure, basically, because he sees the problems of state-controlled material infrastructure. He's embroiled in a hot war where knowledge and all of its resources have become, very clearly part of a power dynamic, and he's trying to move away from that. So it's really interesting to toggle back and forth, as I do in a lot of my work, between England and Central Europe, because they're obviously in conversation with each other, but you're able to see them looking at the other cases and kind of devising strategies for their own situations in response. I'll stop there because this is a complex question. It could go on for a long time.
I'm going to ask, I don't know if this is exactly a follow-up, but it's definitely a question that I know has been on both of our minds. And it's how to relate undisciplining as it's presented here, or perhaps projecting, as a historical phenomenon that comes to be in a certain set of conditions in Europe, to projecting or to projects as a global phenomenon that does not seem to be bounded, or at least you can find analogs that don't necessarily have clear historical causal connections to this phenomenon in Europe. So how to sort of, I guess, navigate between this as a set of events, an unfolding process in one place, and this as an analytical concept that we can take to a bunch of comparative cases. And I think related to that, you're critical of trading zones in the book, and I mean, for good reason, and you're very clear about why. I wonder how extrapolation compares with a concept like translation as it's used in histories of, say, indigenous natural history in the Americas, which again is, taking knowledge from one context to another, could be an epistemic shift, could be a geographical one, could be both. Whether there's a similar tension between extrapolation and that, as there is between extrapolation and trade, the trading zone concept.
Sorry, what was that at the end? Whether there's
a similar reason not to use translation, but to use extrapolation instead.
Oh,
or
okay.
whether they're essentially similar.
I I wouldn't use translation just because translation, although of course there's no perfect translation, and there's many studies of, what happens in the translating process and the creativity of translation, et cetera, and the agency of it. But there is an attempt to kind of capture the kind of intended source space and to recognize difference is the point. The point of extrapolation is to argue that you don't respect the difference and to move things from one place to another because you don't respect that place has that kind of value to it. So translation is all about understanding difference radically and then attempting to bridge difference. Whereas extrapolation would be about saying, I don't care, I'm going to move it from one place to another. So in some ways, they're kind of opposites. I'd love to talk a little bit about waste, if anyone wants to talk about waste some more. I think that's one of the key things also is, again, thinking about Aisha Mukherjee's model where waste is this kind of resource that you're using. Manure, she talks about kind of quite a lot, and waste is something that's very local. You've produced it and then you cycle it back into kind of your situation. What's really interesting to me is the language around waste in projects, which is used in a similar way to the language around identifying what's in the public interest. You identify what is waste, and by arguing that you can turn that waste somehow into something profitable, you're contributing to the public interest. And so to say that certain lands are wastelands or certain natural parts of nature are waste, or that people are waste, that they should have increased capacity to be put to work in a certain different way. It is a way of looking at the world versus your own community as a place to kind of identify and label something that is waste. When it, of course, as Ted, you said in your remarks, is already occupied, already inhabited, not waste necessarily. And so I think that waste works really importantly along with ideas that Frederik's worked on, like scarcity, and should be one of our keywords with waste, risk, scarcity, desire, perhaps, in thinking about these topics.
Can I ask a question, which I think is related to this? And when you were originally responding to the three of us, you said one thing that I don't want to think about credit. I want to move towards responsibility, right? And I think that also connects to this question of waste and who is taking responsibility for production, for use, right? And I think underlying this is like a question of like the environment and like work that's going on in the environmental humanities and histories of empire and how they're coming together, right? How wastelands and people who are waste are connected. So I just wanted you to speak more to that, how maybe thinking about climate change and the climate crisis, how all of that seems to be underlying this book in some ways. So just anything you have to say, I'm really interested in hearing that.
Well, that's kind of one of the important issues with failure, which I should have said another keyword. There's many ways that thinking about failure is really important, but something that it really draws our attention to is the great costs, and therefore waste in a different sense, and perhaps what we would consider waste, the great costs of interloping and projecting. And this has been talked about in the history of science in terms of thinking about scientific progress, that we tend to think in terms of this timeline, and we look at what has succeeded, and we don't look at everything that has sunk and failed and the resources that kind of went into that. And that is a very powerful dynamic that is still with us, and we've probably experienced it all on our campuses, various campuses, in the ways that different disciplines are kind of envisioned. And so the sciences are probably some of the most wasteful places on the planet, like the most environmentally resource-heavy places are probably some laboratories right now. And to really think about kind of that kind of use of resources, paying attention to histories of failure, with an eye to that kind of waste is really important. So the language of identifying waste and promising to turn it into use and into profit can distract us from the kind of huge amounts of waste that is kind of produced in that process. And I think it's really imperative that we pay attention to it rather than get distracted from it. Does that answer what you're saying, Debapriya? Yeah. Frederik.
To comment on that point, there's a really interesting argument in a recently published article by Eric Hirschthal and John Brooke in the latest issue of William and Mary Quarterly. I recommend it to everyone, and it speaks directly to the point you just made, but from a material environmental history perspective. And what they're arguing is that if we're looking for the beginning of the Anthropocene, the climate emergency, we should begin in zones of intensive deforestation, where carbon sinks are reduced, and so we get a heightened level of carbon emissions, of land emissions, right? So not factories belching carbon dioxide, but the destruction of forests. And what they're trying to do is basically quantify the frontier of deforestation across the early modern world. It's not a new argument, but they have new data from Earth system science to play around with, and they point to the West Indies as a key zone of early accelerating land emissions. So in other words, to put it in your terms, here we have a profit-making zone of interloping and emerging plantation slavery that also turns out to be the beginning of the great waste cycle of excess carbon in the atmosphere. Super interesting. There's also they have like a synoptic version of this argument in one of the new Oxford handbooks. I can't think of what it's called. There are so many of them now. It's probably the Oxford Handbook on Environmental History or some such thing. Yeah. Eric Hirschthal and John Brooke.
Hi, Julianne.
Sorry, I had to unmute and start my video. Hi, this was great, and I love the book. Slightly a change of pace question, but it was something that I found myself thinking about as I was reading. And there's something you touch on a lot, but I wondered if you have a few times, I wonder if you had further reflections, which is just religion broadly, right? But one story about undisciplining is a story that begins with the Reformation and then ends with secularization, and encompasses the transformation of the universities, but also the decline of a certain model of standardized communal life centered around the church. And I just wondered if you had further thoughts about that maybe will make their way into the next book or are sort of a wider part of the project.
It's a question that yes, the next book, Superability, yes, it will. It's something I have to tackle with a lot because I'm talking about the fall and theology there in a way that I haven't really in my previous scholarship. But in some ways, what does allow me to skirt this issue a little is the background of the reason of state. And this also speaks to Dominic's question about changes in different places. Reason of state, because it was seen as this like great key to state arcana across Europe, was highly emulative across different religions. So it is something where the kind of ideas about desire and the people and ways to find profit get emulated very, very, very quickly from one place to another place, regardless of religion. And in fact, this is one of the big critiques of reason of state in the period, is to say that it's about regio, not religio. It's about region. They couldn't care about religion, and that religion is seen as a tool of reason of state that you can use kind of instrumentally. Classic example would be allowing Jews to settle and be part of the economy as a way to improve the economy becomes like a classic good practice in the reason of state that's pushed by a lot of statists. And so it's kind of one of those ideas where by offering freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, you're not doing it on religious grounds, you're doing it on purely statist grounds and kind of in a very utilitarian way. And it gets emulated in many places. And so I think that it's a way that I can skirt a little bit talking about like fine religious differences, while at the same time talking about thinking about society, and you're calling in society as having had a kind of religious component that is kind of undercut by reason of state thinking, which is attempting to intervene in place to place, from place to place. At the same time, I do think that some of the promises of great power and profit that experimental philosophy, for example, borrows from projecting, you cannot deny the kind of religious aura and aspect to that. And I think that comes through a lot in the genre of hints that Debapriya mentioned, which is kind of one of my favorite genres, which becomes so popular in sermons initially, because it's about seeing through a cloud darkly, a sense of numinousness, a sense of the divine and power that's kind of there in the region. And that language then gets taken into projects and experimental philosophy, so that there is it's not purely secularized in a way, due to that kind of borrowing of that kind of numinousness, I would say. Did you want to respond, Julianne?
No, I mean, I think that's, I didn't have an angle on that question. It was just one of the things that I was thinking about. I think that's a great response.
Oh, Dominic has a hand again.
Just a quick follow-up on this. I was wondering if again, the difference is like the question of class. Is that something that kind of, or whatever, Stände would be in the kind of British version? Is that something that comes up in this context?
So one of the arguments that I am making is that it is kind of against the idea that science always works with a social leveling or democracy, is the idea that the transition of a kind of nobility of the sword into engaging with, say, natural resources and matter and experimentation into it is really important to look at, because they are bringing these kinds of martial qualities of ambition and rivalry and conquest to what they're doing. And that is part of what Bacon is attempting, and very successfully does, is to kind of create a rhetoric and a culture around experimentation, which is making it non-pedantic, which is saying this isn't something that is for scholars. This is something that is for heroes and conquerors to do. And so thinking about the sense of social standing of the interlopers is really, really important for understanding the ways that they're engaging and the ways that violence plays a role in what they're doing. So often when we talk about kind of global engagements and kind of global knowledge in this period of colonialism, one of the things that I think that we tend to do is try to point to global sources that have been occluded in the ways that they were incorporated into European resources and knowledge. But what's interesting to me about some of these interlopers is the fact that they are not attempting to occlude that. They are attempting to talk about it quite a lot, because it is part of the idea of conquest. And so the ways that global conquest and conquest of knowledge are interrelated is really important in relationship to social standing.
I wanted to ask a bit of a question. It's more of a process question. you mentioned that the three books are sort of you were thinking about them as a trilogy, but like I'm wondering, is that like in hindsight as a trilogy? At what point when you got started did you realize, well, there's enough, like, you sort of follow the trail where it goes, but at what point did you think, oh, there's enough for a second book? And then at what point were you like, maybe let's like keep this going? And now are you thinking like, okay, that's the trilogy and it stands, like sort of just even working through all of this, like how did it take shape in this kind of way,
Well, yes, it wasn't necessarily that planned from the beginning. I never wrote a book about my dissertation. And I thought that my first book was going to be a short book and quick. And then it just opened this can of worms that became extremely large and covered this like 150 time period. And so when I wrote that, I knew that I wanted to kind of delve into, in the future, kind of more situated stories about it. And so that's how it kind of took shape as these kind of three books kind of working together. I doubt there's going to be anyone who reads kind of all three of them, so I don't know if they'll ever be kind of visible as a group. But for me, intellectually, kind of that's how it works. I also think it's important because the argument I'm trying to make is pretty complex. And I needed to have kind of multiple stages to kind of flesh it out so that I could make the knowledge of the public interest argument, use that as the basis for interlopers, and then use interlopers as the basis for what I'm going to say about disciplinarity and where we are now with disciplines kind of in the next book. Because I do see this kind of multiple stages in how these ideas developed, and that I would not be able to make that kind of a complex move in one book. But yes, I didn't sit there and chart it out and be like, okay, so here's book 1, book 2, book 3. It was kind of like, okay, I want to have this big overview. I know in the future I'm going to delve into this more, and so that's what happened.
Thanks. So is there any I'll invite any last questions, any final anyone have any final thoughts?
I just want to thank everyone as my final thought for coming. I really appreciate it. It's been so long since the book was actually published and I haven't had anything to kind of celebrate it because I was department head, so I had no time for anything. So I'm finally crawling out from that, and I just really wanted to thank everyone for kind of helping me celebrate finally this book coming out after, I went through COVID and went through some challenges coming out. So it's really happy that it is here, and that I appreciate you all being here with me.
Cool. No, and I hope everyone will help me in thanking you for coming and talking about it today. So with that, let's all, thank you all very much. And hopefully you guys will join us for our next event. So thank you very much, Vera.
Thank you.
And Ted, Debapriya, and Frederik.
Thanks.